Okay, so we're okay. All right, Facebook has come up live, Walker.
So I will now mute myself and Dan so that Diane, when it's one, you're unmuted so that you can.
Yeah, don't mute Dan yet because I have a question to ask you.
Okay.
Before we get started. And a lot of people that don't tune in until 1 o'clock and think that's when we're going to start. Hey, Dan.
Yes.
I know that you've written a book.
Yes.
On The Last Road North.
Mm-hmm.
Have you published another one, or are you starting another one?
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of irons in the fire right now. I have a book called Ohioans at Antietam that's due to the publisher this coming fall, so it should be out for the anniversary of Antietam next year, so it'll be September 2021. I have a book on the Battle of Second Manassas that's also due to the publisher by the end of this year, so it'll be ready for August of next year. I have a book on Civil War books, actually, a Civil War bibliography that goes from books published about the Civil War from 1997 through around 2017. So that should be coming out within the next year as well. And then I
resource.
Yes. And then I had one essay was just published a couple weeks ago. Actually, two essays in a book called Civil War and Pop Culture through Southern Illinois University Press. I have an essay in there on kind of like the history of the song Dixie.
Yeah.
From its composition through the 21st century, how it's been used and whatnot. And then I also have an essay in there on the song Ashokan Farewell from the Ken Burns documentary. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks think that that's, a period piece from the Civil War, but it was actually composed in the 1980s. So a little history of that. And then I have another essay being published in a collection about what ifs of the Civil War through Southern Illinois University Press, and that should be out next year as well.
I should say you have a lot of irons in the fire.
I do. Yeah, I do. Way too many, actually.
It's true that Dixie was one of Lincoln's favorite songs.
He does talk about at the end of the war. There's a quote of his where he has it performed, and he basically says that the Union is appropriated this song, with the ending of the war and the Union victory, that it's now a Union song. So he does seem to have a musical taste for it, if you will. I don't know if it was one of his favorites, but he definitely has it performed for an audience around him when he's in Washington in April of '65. So,
are your books being published through Emerging Civil War?
The book on Second Manassas will be through Emerging Civil War. The Civil War bibliography will be through Savas Beatty. And the two essay collection books are through Southern Illinois University Press. And the book on Ohioans at Antietam will be through the History Press.
Well, those are nice feathers in your cap.
Yeah, it's. I'm very grateful to the publishers for, kind of getting excited about these projects and saying, yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And it's a lot of fun for me. I really enjoy the research aspect and looking for stories that have kind of been forgotten or people that have been forgotten, and bringing them to the forefront.
I miss researching.
I
a project that I could dig into.
That has been one of the hardest things for historians over the last 8 weeks. It's a great time to write. We're quarantined at home. It's a great time to write. It's a great time to read. But the lack of access that we've had to research, I know a lot of the projects that I've been working on, I've been unable to get stuff that I need to be able to continue to write. So, there's obviously challenges for everyone during this time, these last 2 months. But from a historian's perspective, we've kind of been at a standstill for research and writing. So we're very much looking forward to safe openings of research repositories and being able to get back into those collections.
Yeah, well, libraries are looking forward to opening too. And okay. Well, we have a few minutes. Let me
quickly say hi.
Hi, Maggie.
Dan, thank you so much for doing this. I'm the executive director here, and I think we met a couple of years ago, and I'm so excited to hear this.
We did. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it this afternoon.
Walker, and I'm just eager to participate, but then I'll go behind my wall of invisibility and leave it to you. But I did just shower and dress, for the occasion.
Thank you for that, Maggie.
Yes. But I'll stick around. I'll sit up straight.
Okay.
Last time a cat attended, I don't see my cat anywhere, so it's but we'll see.
Okay, we have a few people on Facebook. Allison Kavanaugh Barish, and she's such a good friend of the library and the SB Post. Rich Condon, all the way down in South Carolina, is watching. Rich just moved from Pittsburgh. He's taken a job down at the in Beaufort, South Carolina, as the at the Reconstruction National Museum. So we miss you, Rich. Okay, let's get started here then. First of all, I'm Diane Kleinfelder. I am the curator for the Captain Thomas SB Post located at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall. And we want to welcome you to our second Saturday Civil War series. Normally, this is done in our beautiful Lincoln Gallery in the library, but we had to resort to technology back in March. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Walker Evans, our library director, for bringing technology to me. I never heard of Zoom before all this started. But thank you, Walker, for making all this magic for us.
My pleasure, Diane. Thank you.
A couple announcements. We did have a bus tour planned for June for our second Saturday, but I canceled that early on thinking that this might last a while. So as of right now, I don't have anything planned, but please check our website, carnegie.org, or the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall Facebook page, or the Captain Thomas SB Facebook page, because we will have information up on what's going on in June. Now, you may think that this has nothing to do with Civil War, but next Saturday, I'm going to be doing a lecture on beginning genealogy, and that's 1 o'clock, and that will be on either Facebook Live or Zoom. A lot of people call and say, how do I find who my Civil War ancestors are? So you kind of do have to have very basic understanding of going about studying your family history. So if you are interested, or you know of somebody that may be interested, that's next Saturday at 1 o'clock. So let me introduce our speaker. Dan Welch gave this talk, I think it was the first Civil War symposium that we did. And that was several years ago, back before 2012, I think. But I was so moved by it. And I just thought, given the Zoom and Facebook, and that it would be a nice presentation to do online. April, of course, is the month that the Civil War began. It's also the month that our Civil War ended. But more importantly, it's the month that we lost our president, Abraham Lincoln. And Dan has done a wonderful job at going back and looking at how the nation responded to that tragedy. So Dan is currently a primary and secondary education teacher with a public school over in Ohio. Previously, he was the education programs coordinator for the Gettysburg Foundation, who is a partner of the Gettysburg National Military Park. And Dan also serves as a seasonal park ranger there. Now, he received his bachelor's degree in instrumental music education from Youngstown State University, and his master's in military history from the American Military University, but he has a concentration in the Civil War era. His first book was The Last Road North, A Guide to the Gettysburg Campaign. That was released in 2016, and he was just telling us about all the other books that he has coming out. And he does all that with his wife, Sarah, from Boardman, Ohio. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan, and thank you for doing this for us.
Well, wonderful. And thank you, before we get started today, to Diane and Maggie and Walker for allowing me an opportunity to share with you a really interesting story from 1865 and in the years and decades following not only the end of the American Civil War, but the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and how our country reacted to that pivotal moment in 1865. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you so you can follow along to this presentation that we're going to have today. It's going to be about 45 to 50 minutes in length. So if you were debating on that cup of coffee or a cup of hot tea on this cold, snowy afternoon here, at least in Youngstown, Ohio, you may want to grab one and grab your computer or bring it to your computer screen, as we're going to be together during that time period. And then if you have any questions at the end, we'll take some time to answer any questions that you may have about the program or the Civil War or Gettysburg or whatever else you may be interested in on this afternoon. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you here. And I apologize, although I have the age of a millennial, I am not one for a large amount of technology. So I am going to share my screen here so we can get started. All right. On November 19th, 1863, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln would travel to Gettysburg and he would participate in the dedication ceremony of a new national cemetery that had been created on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Lincoln's speech that day would be just around 272 words. It would last about 2.5 minutes in length. And in it, Lincoln said that what had been done at Gettysburg was an altogether fitting and proper tribute to the dead, not only from the Battle of Gettysburg, but that had given their lives in defense of the Union. And now this new federal war aim in 1863 of ending slavery once and for all in this country. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today are these many different tributes that will be given in response to the death and assassination of Abraham Lincoln 155 years ago last month. And so I ask you today at home to think about what is an altogether fitting and proper tribute to the dead. Not only the dead of the American Civil War, maybe those that have passed in your personal life, what is an altogether fitting and proper tribute to them? Is a written word, is poetry or a short story or an essay a proper tribute to remember these people? Is a speech given in front of a large audience or at a gravesite a proper tribute to those that have passed in a monumental struggle like that of the American Civil War? What about monuments and memorials? Certainly veterans believed that monuments and memorials were an altogether fitting and proper tribute to the dead that had given everything, given that last full measure of devotion from 1861 to 1865. And they continued to be an important, serve as an important touchstone of remembering those that have passed. And what about music? What about a song or a composition? Is that an altogether fitting and proper tribute to the dead? One of the stories that I want to share with you today does not begin in 1865, but it's a personal story and probably one of my first experiences that I can remember of a quote, altogether fitting and proper tribute. And it comes during the time period of the First Gulf War in the early 1990s. One of the things I can remember is my hometown news station on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday evenings, right after the news hour. 6 o'clock was our local news from 6 to 6:30. 6:30 to 7 p.m. was our national news on this local news channel. And then those couple moments between 6:58, 6:59, and 7 p.m. before regular broadcasting would pick back up, there would be a montage of photographs, primarily of the American Civil War, and Lee Greenwood's song, "I'm Proud to Be an American." And this went on every Saturday and Sunday throughout the length of the First Gulf War. And something that really struck me then as a youngster was that this was a really a nice gesture, a proper tribute to those that were fighting throughout that conflict miles away from home, and those that had given what Lincoln called in 1863 a fitting and proper tribute. So today, our story of these fitting and proper tributes to Lincoln following his assassination then are going to begin on the fateful evening of April 14th, 1865. And for those of you that are joining in today, you know the story. Abraham Lincoln and his wife will travel to Ford's Theater. They will make their way to a play that evening known as Our American Cousin. They will arrive late to the play. It will be slightly delayed as they take their seats in their box. Accompanying them that evening is an officer in the Union Army, a man by the name of Rathbone, with a young woman by the name of Harris. As the play returns back to normal, the president and those that are attending the play with him in his box have taken their seats, and it won't be too much longer before a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth will enter Ford's Theater, make his way to the box, enter the box itself, and he will pull the trigger of his Derringer pistol behind the head of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln will slouch over. Rathbone will jump to the defense of the party inside the box. He will be injured in that attempt from a long dagger or knife that Booth had with him. Booth will jump out of the box, landing on the stage itself, yelling those famous words, "Sic semper tyrannis," and make his escape over the next 2 weeks. Lincoln will be removed from the box. He will be carried across the street to the Peterson House, and there for the rest of the evening of April 14th and into the wee hours in the morning of April 15th, Lincoln will struggle to survive this grievous wound. In the 7 o'clock hour on the morning of April 15th, Lincoln will finally take his last breath. And his trusty Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, will then exclaim that Lincoln now belongs to the ages. He will later reword it to now saying that Lincoln belonged to the angels. As news of the assassination of Lincoln began to ripple across the country, and the country would enter into a period of mourning, we begin to see an immediate reaction of those expressing their reactions to the assassination through various forms of tribute. And one of the first forms we're going to look at today in honor of Abraham Lincoln is going to come to us from a man by the name of Walt Whitman. Now, before we get to Whitman's story here, I've just put up a sketch of Lincoln's final moments on the early morning of April 15th, 1865. So you have a moment to look at some of those in attendance. You can see Edwin Stanton there. He has that piece of paper behind his back. Gideon Welles, Secretary of Navy, some of the medical staff that had been at Lincoln's bedside for a majority of April 14th into the morning of April 15th. One of the people absent in this sketch that you will notice is Mrs. Lincoln herself. She had become too distraught every time she entered the room, and Edwin Stanton would eventually order her to remain outside of the room, particularly during Lincoln's last breaths. So Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is a very well-known American poet in the 19th century by the time of 1865. Whitman had been born at the end of May of 1819. He would live a very long life. He would not pass away until March of 1892. He was known not only as a poet throughout the 19th century, an American poet, but also as an essayist and a journalist. And ultimately, Walt Whitman would eventually earn the notoriety as, above all, a humanist. He was part of this transitionatory period in his career that really came smack dab between a movement known as transcendentalism in the United States and that of the realist movement. And what made Whitman's works so important to the literary scene in the United States as well as the world was that he incorporated both views into his writings, into his poetry and his essays and his journalism. And thus Whitman would become one of the most influential poets in American canon, and he would often be called, after his death, the father of free verse. Now, Whitman's works of the 19th century were not without controversy, particularly in his own time. One particularly controversial collection of poetry was that known as Leaves of Grass, which was described as incredibly obscene for the time period for its overt sexuality. And Whitman's major works, Leaves of Grass, had been published not too long before the start of the American Civil War in 1855, Whitman having to use his own money to get the work published. But the work was an attempt at reaching out to the common person with this American epic. And Whitman, above all, would really reach the common American person with his tribute to Abraham Lincoln just 10 years later. Now, when the American Civil War began, Whitman was working many jobs at the time period. He was working as a journalist, writing articles. He was working as a government clerk. He was also publishing his poetry. He was an incredibly busy man to try to make it in this time period as a writer. But when the war broke out, he decided that his services as a government clerk and as a poet and as a teacher and a journalist was not enough for the war effort. And so he decided to volunteer as a nurse during the war. And he would write substantial accounts of his experiences as a nurse. Whitman himself would work so tirelessly as a nurse, at one point he would have to give it up as he had become incredibly ill and almost perished himself from his exertions. Now, during the American Civil War, Whitman was a staunch Unionist. He believed that the federal government needed to win this conflict to bring the Union back together again. But he was initially indifferent to Abraham Lincoln. But as the war pressed on, Whitman's perceptions of Lincoln and Lincoln's policies and what he was trying to do would soften, and Whitman came to love the president, although the two would never meet during Lincoln's tenure. So upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, Whitman would compose a poem that he would title, "O Captain, My Captain." Now, the poem is classified as an elegy or a mourning poem, and obviously was written as a fitting tribute to honor Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. The fallen captain in the poem refers to Lincoln himself. The captain of the ship, a ship that is the United States of America. The poem would go on to discuss many themes, such as the immense loss of life that the war had produced, the joy and celebration of the restored Union, as well as many others. Listen now as we hear the words of Whitman's tribute to the martyred President Lincoln. "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills. For you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores a-crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My Captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful dread walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain would become one of Whitman's most famous poems. The common American grasped its meaning, its deep desire to honor the martyred president that had been assassinated. And it would be one that Whitman would end many of his famous lectures that he would give in the coming months and years following that fateful month of April of 1865. But after more than a decade, after the Lincoln assassination, and Whitman still trying to move beyond this poem that he had gotten typecast for writing, he would later write towards the end of his life, "Damn my Captain, I'm almost sorry I ever wrote the poem." Although he would feel that towards the end of his career, it was the feelings that Whitman had in April of 1865 that had led him to show this fitting and proper tribute to Abraham Lincoln upon his assassination. Now, whereas Whitman would seek out the written word, where he would seek out this form of poetry as a form of tribute to Lincoln, others decided on that of a monument or a memorial. Monuments and memorials were nothing new by 1865. They were nothing new in the post-war era. That these monuments and memorials were beginning to spring up across the American countryside. Gettysburg being no different, with some of the earliest monuments and memorials being placed on the battlefield itself in the years following the war. And one of the first public monuments to honor Abraham Lincoln would come after his death, and it was a statue that would be erected in front of the District of Columbia City Hall in 1868, just 3 years after his assassination. Now, you can imagine the cost of a substantial memorial or monument in the late 1860s was immense, not only to be able to procure an artisan, but the materials needed, marble or bronze or granite, some very high-end material, and then paying for the labor and the transportation to get it set up. So it is a very large ordeal, and it's a very ornate way to pay tribute to the martyred Lincoln. And this monument that you see here pictured in the early 2000s, when this photograph was taken, was originally paid for via a subscription among Washington, D.C. business owners, including a substantial contribution from a man by the name of John T. Ford. And through all of these subscriptions and benefit concerts and performances at Ford's Theater, the money would be raised to construct this monument at the District of Columbia City Hall. Now, the white marble statue that you see today was designed by sculptor Lot Flannery and originally was erected in 1868. And attending the ceremony at its dedication was none other than President Johnson and Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. Now, the statue was originally far more ornate and, quote, fitting and proper than it is today. And it would have rested in 1868 and for many years after on a pedestal more than 30 feet high in the air. But in 1919, following the end of World War I, and after the courthouse you see behind it was renovated, the statue was taken down. Many protests would erupt because the statue had come to mean so much for those in Washington, D.C. And one of the largest voices in this protest was the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants of the District of Columbia. According to a Washington Post article of the time, a certain Colonel Clarence S. Ridley, superintendent of public grounds and buildings, had decided that the statue interfered with the architectural beauty of the renovated courthouse, and that was his response as to why it was taken down. But these protests would not end. And over the course of the next 4 years, there were many that said that this fitting and proper tribute, that funds that had been raised in the years following Lincoln's assassination, needed to be returned back to Washington, D.C. And so finally, in 1923, the statue was reinstalled on its current base that you can see pictured here today in the early 2000s. Now, this statue to Lincoln as a fitting and proper tribute to his time as president, to his service to the United States, and ultimately his assassination, is not the only one. You can imagine there are many, many more statues to Lincoln across the country. And it is none other than Gettysburg that has perhaps one of the highest number of Lincoln statues throughout the town and around the town itself. Some of the many monuments to Abraham Lincoln that you can find in and around Gettysburg include the Lincoln Speech Memorial, which is inside the National Cemetery, has a small bronze bust of Abraham Lincoln in the middle. On the left-hand side, it has the invitation that Gettysburg National Cemetery Commissioner David Wills will write, inviting Lincoln to come to Gettysburg to say a few remarks, and it will also have the words of the Gettysburg Address on it. As you're on the Gettysburg battlefield itself and you come across the largest monument on the Gettysburg battlefield, the Pennsylvania Memorial, has a bronze statue to Abraham Lincoln. If you stop by the David Wills House in downtown Gettysburg, a recent addition to the National Park Service at Gettysburg within the last decade, this is where Lincoln will stay and complete the Gettysburg Address on the evening of November 18th, just the day before of 1863. There's a 20th century statue just out front there. If you swing by the Visitor Center for the National Park Service and Gettysburg Foundation, you will see a Lincoln sitting just outside the main entrance of the Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center. If you go to the Adams County Library, the Gettysburg branch, pictured right here on the slide you see in front of you, you can see another monument to Abraham Lincoln and his time at Gettysburg in the month of November of 1863. And if you look on the left of the slide, you can swing by Gettysburg College and see another memorial to Abraham Lincoln. Interestingly enough, there are currently 6 different statues honoring Abraham Lincoln. If you include the Kentucky Memorial in the National Cemetery, you're looking at a total of 7 statues honoring Abraham Lincoln in the small town of Gettysburg, a place that he visited just shy of 24 hours on November 18th and 19th, 1863. So far, we've seen the country react in many ways to Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865 and onwards. We've seen notable poets and writers such as Walt Whitman compose words in honor of Lincoln. We've seen those that have deemed a more fitting and proper tribute in the way of monuments and memorials. Another fitting tribute that we see in the weeks, months, and years after the assassination of Lincoln are those of associations and organizations. Now, shortly after Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the 16th President of the United States, a deep sense of loss and mourning ripples across the country and even through the South. Although Lincoln was ridiculed and ostracized, and by many of his contemporaries, both in the House and the Senate, in Washington, D.C., and newspapers across the North, by many of his generals in the ranks, this sense of mourning, this profound loss that was felt across the country upon his assassination, was incredibly true, and it was felt by all walks of life, and particularly a small group of business and civic leaders in Jersey City, New Jersey. This small group of business and civic leaders in this town would initially meet to mourn the grave loss that the nation had experienced in the death of Abraham Lincoln. And many of them had felt this loss in an incredibly personal and intense way. And so as these small business owners, these civic leaders in Jersey City, New Jersey, continue to meet and discuss the impact that Lincoln had on the country in his short time in office, they decided that they were going to make a vow that on each year of the anniversary of Lincoln's birth, on February 12th, that they would meet and they would come together and they would honor his memory. They would discuss the obstacles that he overcame in his early years at these annual meetings. They would talk about his firm and fair philosophies, his vision and courage, and his many achievements. Each year, as they continued to meet on February 12th, more and more were added to these meetings and these ceremonies as a tribute to Lincoln. In addition to music of the time period, of Lincoln's period, these annual memorial ceremonies would include presentations. They would include reenactments. They would include speeches as well as readings, reports by authors and scholars who specialized in Lincoln's history. And despite cold weather, you can imagine New Jersey in February every year, and wars that would ripple across the globe in 1898 and 1914 and 1941 and into the later half of the 20th century. The successors to this small group have never failed to meet, not once. No other organization has a longer record of annual dinners honoring Abraham Lincoln than this organization, the Jersey City Lincoln Association. Now, in the late 1920s, the members of the Lincoln Association initiated a plan to erect a monument to their martyred hero, a monument you can see in this modern-day image in front of you on your screen. Members of the association went throughout not only Jersey City and New Jersey, but as far of a reach as they had in the 1920s to raise funds to build this statue. And you could buy a subscription for just 25 cents. The final total needed for the statue would be $3,500, of which getting them across the finish line would be Jersey City school children that had donated all of the pennies and nickels that they had gathered in the months during the subscription drive. With the money in hand, James Earl Fraser would be hired to design the monument, and Fraser had a very good resume for designing things. He had been commissioned to design the Buffalo nickel, and he had also been a builder of monuments in New York and Washington, and was commissioned to design and build this memorial at the intersection of Belmont Avenue and Hudson Boulevard in Jersey City, New Jersey. So the Lincoln Association in Jersey City had found this fitting and proper tribute, not only by meeting in the early years, but by the 1920s, raising the fund to put up something more permanent, this memorial that they had erected. But they wouldn't stop there. Later, the association would be instrumental in having the park that would surround the statue renamed in honor of Abraham Lincoln. In 1963, the thoroughfare would be renamed in honor of yet another assassinated president. The statue's location is now known as the intersection of Lincoln Park and John F. Kennedy Boulevard. Now, at the dedication of the statue, after it had been completed and was ready for its dedication ceremony in 1930, the Lincoln Association began another tradition. Each year, members would gather to hear recitations of some of Lincoln's memorable addresses and correspondence and to lay a wreath at the foot of the statue. Although the Lincoln assassination has officers and trustees, it has no formal membership. Everyone who reveres the memory of Abraham Lincoln is welcome to participate in the monument ceremony and attend the annual dinner, where speakers further illuminate the man and his memory. So we begin to see these different reactions of how Lincoln was mourned in those weeks, months, and years following his assassination. The written word, monuments and memorials, and even the formation of groups honoring Lincoln and his dedication and service to the United States. Another way that Lincoln would be remembered in the aftermath of his assassination would be through numerous speeches given as Lincoln's funeral train would arrive in different cities as it headed westward back towards Springfield from Washington, D.C., speeches that would be given in city halls, public squares, speeches that would be given at the Senate floor and the House of Representatives. Speeches would continue to be a way that many would honor Lincoln. And one particular speech would call for citizens of the United States to never forget what Lincoln had done in those years in the White House in the 1860s before his assassination. And I think it's an interesting tribute because the author of this speech is none other than James Garfield, a Civil War veteran himself, later President of the United States. Garfield would challenge us to pay a fitting and proper tribute to Lincoln each and every year in this speech, a very powerful speech that he would give. Now, for those of you that don't know the background to James Garfield, he was raised in incredibly humble circumstances in my native Ohio on a farm by his widowed mother. He would work various jobs, including on a canal boat in his formative years, before, at the age of 17, attending several Ohio schools. He would finally select and study at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, from which he graduated in 1856. Just a year later, upon graduation in 1857, Garfield would enter politics as a Republican in this new Republican Party. He would very quickly get married to Lucretia Rudolph just a year after that in 1858, and he would serve as a member of the Ohio State Senate from 1859 to 1861. Now, as the secession crisis began in the fall of 1860 and would sweep across the lower South in the coming weeks and months into the spring of 1861, Garfield would be incredibly opposed to the secessionist movement. And as such, he would eventually serve in the Union Army. He would fight at the battles of Middle Creek, Shiloh, and Chickamauga. And in 1862, he would be elected to Congress to represent Ohio's 19th district. Now, throughout Garfield's extended congressional service after the Civil War, he would firmly support the gold standard, and he would gain a very solid reputation as a skilled orator. And he would initially agree with radical Republican views regarding Reconstruction in the post-war era, but he would later favor a more moderate approach for civil rights enforcement for freedmen. On April 14th, 1866, on the one-year anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, Garfield would make several remarks on the House floor entitled "The Memory of Abraham Lincoln." For Garfield, as a veteran of the Union Army, as someone that had been in public service for many years, almost a decade at this point, this would be his fitting and proper tribute that he would give to the martyred president. He would begin that address on the one-year anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by saying, "Mr. Speaker, I desire to move that this House do now adjourn. And before the vote upon that motion is taken, I desire to say a few words. This day, Mr. Speaker, will be sadly memorable, so long as this nation shall endure, which God grant may be till the last syllable of recorded time, when the volume of human history shall be sealed up and delivered to the omnipotent judge. In all future time, on the recurrence of this day, I doubt not that citizens of this republic will meet in solemn assembly to reflect upon the life and character of Abraham Lincoln, the awful tragic event of April 14th, 1865. An event unparalleled in the history of nations, certainly unparalleled in our own. It is eminently proper that this House should this day place upon its records a memorial of that event." Garfield would continue with his speech, touching on themes relating to Lincoln's character, religion, and memory. But what Garfield called for was an annual moment of silence every April 14th from 1866 onward until the end of recorded time. He called for groups to come together, to assemble, as he said, to reflect on the life and character of Abraham Lincoln, something that those small business owners and civic leaders in Jersey City, New Jersey had started just a year earlier. And so we have seen these various formats in which the reaction to the Lincoln assassination had occurred through the written word, through speeches, through associations, memberships, through monuments and memorials. And we're going to end our story today with perhaps one of the most profound reactions to the Lincoln assassination, and perhaps one of the most ongoing forms of fitting and proper tribute, and that of music that has been written, composed, and played in honor of Abraham Lincoln. And for that, we are going to travel today to New York and New York City and hear about the tribute that the New York Philharmonic Orchestra would give in honor of the martyred president in April 1865. Now, the New York Philharmonic was not a new orchestra by the time of Lincoln's death in 1865. It had been founded in 1842 by the American conductor Urieli Corelli Hill, pictured on the left side of your screen, with the aid of an Irish composer by the name of William Vincent Wallace. Now, Urieli Corelli Hill, one of the founders of the New York Philharmonic, had been born in 1820 in New York. He had organized a meeting at the ripe old age of 22 on April 2nd, 1842, at which the New York Philharmonic Society was founded. At the meeting, Hill would be named the first president of the New York Philharmonic Society, and he would open the New York Philharmonic Society's inaugural concert on December 7th, 1842, by conducting a very challenging and well-known piece of the era, the Fifth Symphony by Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, the other founder of the New York Philharmonic at this time period was a man by the name of William Wallace. Wallace had been born in Waterford, Ireland, and he had moved to the United States and found himself in New Orleans in 1841, Philadelphia in 1842, Boston in 1843, and he would finally reach New York in 1844. Within 6 years, William Wallace had become an American citizen, and by 1850, he had found himself in New York, and he would be helping to bolster this newly formed New York Philharmonic Society. Now, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra at this time was called the Philharmonic Society of New York, and it had quite a history. It was the third Philharmonic on American soil since 1799, and it had as its intended purpose, quote, to advance instrumental music, end quote, in the United States. And one of the ways that they would advance the study and appreciation of instrumental music was by performing numerous concerts. And they would perform these concerts at the beginning in a place known as the Apollo Rooms. Unfortunately, the Apollo Room, where these early concerts took place, no longer stands today. But on your screen, you'll eventually see, as I know we're having a little bit of lag in the presentation today, you'll eventually see a sketch of the Apollo Rooms. And it was here that the first concert of the Philharmonic Society took place on December 7th, 1842, in the Apollo Rooms, which was located on Lower Broadway, and it would have an audience of 600 people. The concert, as I mentioned, would open with Beethoven's famed Symphony No. 5, led by Hill himself. Two other conductors would assist in the concert that evening. German-born Henry Christian Timond and French-born Denis Etienne would lead parts of the eclectic 3-hour program, which would include chamber music and several operatic selections with a leading singer of the day, as was the custom. Now, as the Philharmonic Society continued to put on these concerts, they were achieving their mission to advance the appreciation and understanding of instrumental music. After only a dozen performances, and barely just 4 years old, by 1846, the New York Philharmonic organized a concert to raise funds to build a new music hall. They had simply outgrown their performing venue space. So they start rehearsing for this grand concert in which donations would be accepted to help kick off this campaign of raising funds to build a new performance venue. The centerpiece of this concert was going to be the American premiere of a Beethoven symphony, Symphony No. 9. And it was going to take place at Castle Garden on the southern tip of Manhattan. About 400 instrumental and vocal performers would gather for this premiere, which was going to be conducted by George Loder. This was the biggest to-do in the history of music at this time period. Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 required the most number of musicians for any piece that had been composed up to that point. Again, 400 instrumentalists and vocal performers. All of the singing components would have to be translated from German into English to be able to be performed. It would be the first time that that would be happening as well. And so as the Philharmonic Society is rehearsing and gathering musicians and having these chorales translated into English, they put out a price tag for their concert subscription to go towards the building of their new music venue of $2 a ticket. $2 a ticket in 1846 was an incredibly expensive price to come to see this premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And what would hinder the raising of funds even further was scheduled for the same evening of the performance was a war rally being held uptown from their location for the Mexican-American War that had erupted. The hoped-for audience would be kept away, and the new hall would have to wait to be built until the society could raise enough funds. Eventually, however, they would raise the funds they needed to begin construction of this new hall, and their new performance venue would be known as the Academy of Music, and it would be located in Manhattan. Taking the reins of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra at this time period in this new performance venue would be a man by the name of Theodore Eisfeld. Theodore Eisfeld had been born in Brunswick in 1816 and would eventually come to New York in 1848. And in 1849, he was the first man chosen by the New York Philharmonic Society to be the sole conductor for the entire season of concerts in 1849. Now, before this time, it had been customary for several musicians to share the conducting duties. And he would be very revolutionary in taking the New York Philharmonic to the next level. One of the things he would do would begin a custom of giving an annual Christmas performance of Handel's Messiah, a tradition that still happens today in 2020. He would also introduce the first regular concerts of chamber music in New York. Before Eisfeld arriving and taking the conducting reins of the New York Philharmonic, they would play largely symphonies or pieces of music that would require a large number of musicians to perform. But now he was looking at regular concerts of chamber music, concerts that would include ensembles of 5 or 8, maybe 10 players at a time. On February 18th, 1851, he would begin a series of quartet concerts, an even smaller ensemble setting, with the first being given at Hope Chapel. Eisfeld was a big to-do in the New York music scene and the New York City music scene, because not only would he be leading the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, he would be the first conductor of the Brooklyn Philharmonic Society, which was founded in 1857, just 4 years before the American Civil War began.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you able to restart your screen sharing, please? I don't think that your changing slides are coming through for everybody right now.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
All right, we're going to get restarted here on the screen sharing. I think we froze for a moment. Technology is a wonderful thing, and sometimes it has its challenges.
If it works, it does.
So we will get caught back up here for a moment. Let me take you back and get you caught up with the story a little bit. I think we last left off with James Garfield. This was just an oil painting of James Garfield. You can see a very short snippet. It's going to catch up here in just a second of James Garfield's speech, and then we'll get you caught back up with some of the images as well. I can see it catching up. So there's James Garfield, again, would give that well-known speech, at least well-known in the day, long since forgotten, in honor of the martyred President Abraham Lincoln, in which he called for an annual gathering every year on April the 15th and April the 14th to honor Abraham Lincoln. Following that, it brings us to our next slide, which is the beginnings of the New York Philharmonic. The New York Philharmonic would be founded large part by the two men you see pictured here on the screen, Ureli Hill and William Wallace. The Apollo Rooms is where the New York Philharmonic would have some of its earliest concerts, including Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. For those of you that are not the biggest of classical music into it, it's a very well-known piece if you're familiar with, and pardon my singing over the internet today, bum, 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 bum. That's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Those early performances of the New York Philharmonic would take place here in the Apollo Rooms, but within just several short years, 4 years, they had gathered such a following through their concert subscription series that they needed a larger performance venue. That venue would eventually be built despite trying to raise funds during the Mexican-American War, which had broken out in 1846. The New York Philharmonic Society, as I noted, had tried to entice people to purchased tickets at $2 a piece to a world premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but unfortunately the expensive price tag of $2 a piece at a competing war rally for the Mexican-American War would limit the amount of funds they received, and it would take several more years in which to raise enough funds to build their new performance venue, which would be known as the Academy Music, and it would be located in Manhattan. And that brings us up to where we were as we were having those technical difficulties. And the man that you're going to see on your screen here in just a moment, that of Theodore Eisfeld. Now, when Eisfeld would take the reins of the New York Philharmonic Society and the New York Philharmonic Orchestra as its conductor, as we mentioned, he would really raise the bar and the profile by doing various things that had not been done before by the New York Philharmonic, including annual Christmas performances of Handel's Messiah, a number of chamber concerts, quartets, really raising the overall profile. He would also become the first conductor of the Brooklyn Philharmonic Society, which had been founded in 1857. So this man here was a really big to-do in the music scene in the years leading up to the American Civil War. And he would continue in this position throughout the duration of the war itself, although he would alternate sometimes between 1862 and 1865 with another conductor by the name of Theodore Thomas. Now, in the spring of 1865, the New York Philharmonic was going to be hosting their annual spring subscription concert. And a subscription concert is basically this. A large majority of the sales of the subscription to the concert goes towards really funding the orchestra and the society itself for the coming concert season a year into the future. So these are really important concerts, and this concert had already been on the schedule for months by the time that the end of the American Civil War had come to a conclusion, or at least the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, the assassination of Lincoln, and his death the following day on April 15th. And just 2 weeks later, on April 29th, 1865, as Lincoln's body over the last 2 weeks has been making its way towards Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's funeral train has arrived in Columbus, Ohio. And during the morning hours of April 29th, 1865, miles away in Manhattan, New York, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra is preparing for this subscription concert to take place later that evening. They are still under the direction of the German-born Theodore Eisfeld, and the orchestra over the course of the previous 2 weeks has been under a constant pressure to master an added piece to their scheduled performance, a piece that is going to be a fitting and proper tribute to the fallen Abraham Lincoln. Now, I want to put this in context for you. These musicians have been practicing. They've been practicing this spring subscription concert for the last several months. They've been practicing at their homes. They've now started to come together as an orchestra. They have been practicing together as a whole. And at the final moments, these last 14 days before this very important concert, their conductor, Theodore Eisfeld, says, look, our commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, has now become a martyred president. We need to add something to this concert. And in this limited amount of time, despite all of these other incredibly challenging pieces of music, I need you to go home and master your part for this new song. And I need you to be able to be so well versed in it in the next 10, 12 days that when we come together for our last practice, on the morning of April 29th, we are going to have it mastered for that evening's performance. Already scheduled on the evening of April 29th's spring subscription concert was an incredibly challenging recitative by George Frederick Handel, and perhaps best known for Handel's Messiah. It was a small work or portion thereof of the Messiah that would be on the program. Following that program would be another incredibly challenging piece by Ludwig von Beethoven, the massive Ninth Symphony, what they had tried to premiere back in 1846 as the American premiere of it, with these 400 musicians and vocalists having all of the German words translated into English for the chorale sections. They're going to be doing this piece as well. So these are two really complex, difficult pieces of music to perform. And the concert is not going to end there. Following these two works, a brief intermission is going to take place. And following the intermission, the orchestra still had two more pieces of music to perform. They had Felix Mendelssohn's Die Lorelei, Opus 98, the finale from Act 1. And they are also going to have Robert Schumann's overture, a portion of it, one of his overtures, the Scherzo, and the finale in E major, Opus 52, to perform. Now, this program would challenge even the world's best orchestras today in 2020. Let alone an orchestra of the 19th century with all the inherent challenges of instruments of the 19th century and performance venues of the period. Think about the lighting. Think about the acoustics of a performance venue in 1865. Think about instruments not having modern amenities and technology that we have today in instruments, where we use all sorts of valve oils and slide grease for our brass instruments, where we use synthetic hairs and for string bows, and we use synthetic strings on our string instruments, or we no longer use natural skins for our percussion section and the timpani and the bass drum and the snare drum and all these things, all these inherent challenges. This program would challenge the best of musicians today in 2020, let alone the New York Philharmonic in April of 1865. And it's at this point, with all of these very complex pieces on the schedule, that the death of Abraham Lincoln would have a last-minute addition to their performance. And with the death of Lincoln on the morning of April 15th and the country's plunge into despair and mourning, the orchestra director and conductor, Theodore Eisfeld, decided that a piece must be added to this concert, that it would be inappropriate not to recognize, to pay tribute to Abraham Lincoln at this concert scheduled 2 weeks from the date. And so he decided to add the funeral march from Beethoven's Third Symphony. And you can see an oil painting of Beethoven on the left, and you can see a portion of the original sheet music, if you will, in Beethoven's handwriting of the funeral march to Beethoven's Symphony No. 3. Now, Beethoven's Third Symphony was yet another challenging composition for the orchestra to tackle, let alone to be able to bring it up to a top-notch performance with just 2 weeks to the concert. I mean, you can imagine if you went to a concert today of your favorite band. One of the things that I like to compare this to is one of my favorite rock and roll bands, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Imagine going to see Lynyrd Skynyrd, and you went to this whole concert. You saw the opening act, which you didn't really care about. You were there for Lynyrd Skynyrd. You saw the whole Lynyrd Skynyrd show, and they closed the show and didn't play Freebird. Or they closed the show and they didn't play Sweet Home Alabama. You would ask for your money back. Or if you went to your most favorite band's show or concert and there was audio quality problems, you would ask for your money back. Or if you went to the theater and saw a movie today, and at some point during the movie, the digital movie projector went down, and all you had was the audio, you would ask for your money back. Imagine going to an orchestral concert and the piece that they performed was below subpar. You would ask for your money back. This is a challenging piece to add to an already challenging concert. To be able to bring it up to the performance standard that the New York Philharmonic had established for themselves in the last 2 decades was quite a challenge. Now, granted, this piece, the Funeral March from Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, was nothing new. It had premiered, over 4 decades earlier. It had been a piece that perhaps the orchestra was familiar with, but even returning to a work by Beethoven years after a performance still required incredibly well-trained and seasoned musicians. Additionally, the Funeral March was not a short movement by any extent from the Third Symphony. Performance times would range from anywhere from 15 to 18 minutes in length. That's a lot of music to learn in just 14 days. Adding this piece to the beginning of an already challenging concert could strain the limits of the New York Philharmonic. And you would not want to do this when you were adding this piece as a fitting and proper tribute to Abraham Lincoln. Now, what made this so hard? What made this piece such a challenge for the orchestra? Well, there were several aspects of the Funeral March that challenged the instrumentation of just 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 3 French horns, 2 trumpets, timpani, and strings. It was written in the key of C minor. It had a trio in what we call musical theory, a parallel major of C major, and it would have a number of what we call fugatos. Now, a fugato is defined as a section of a piece of music that contains all of the elements and style of a traditional fugue, but it's not a real fugue itself. One music historian by the name of Dr. Martha Best Lewis describes the challenges that musicians face when attempting to play any form of a fugue. And for any of you musicians out there tuning in today and have ever performed a fugue, you understand. But Lewis describes the challenges of fugues as this. She says, quote, "Fugues are one of the most challenging of musical forms, perhaps even the most challenging. The structure is incredibly dense. It's entwined and alarmingly cerebral. A musician needs to have understanding of harmonic structures, intervals, articulation, ability to hear melodic lines buried in the texture, finger dexterity to bring these voices to the forefront of one another, a good work ethic, and perseverance." So these were the challenges that laid ahead for the New York Philharmonic on the evening of April 29th, 1865, as it was to pay tribute to Abraham Lincoln. As patrons arrived to the concert hall, they would receive a concert program of the night's pieces. And placed into that paper concert program that evening was the following. And I think one of the really cool aspects of this program today is you are seeing a digitized image of the actual program that was handed out on April 29th, 1865, on the left. And on the right of the screen, you're seeing the actual insert, a digitized copy from the archives of the New York Philharmonic Society that was placed in there explaining what the New York Philharmonic was going to do to give this fitting tribute to Lincoln on that evening's concert. For those of you following along at home, you may be able to make out the original typeface on the right hand of your screen. But if you're unable to, let me share with you what that insert said in the program you would have received that evening. It said, "The entire community of this city shares with the nation the deep grief into which our land has been plunged by the sudden and awful death of our late Chief Magistrate, the President of the United States. While thus sorrowing, it has been, though, a fitting tribute to our departed head, to prefix to the program of the concert the Funeral March from Beethoven's Third Symphony, which was expressly composed for the occasion of the death of a great hero." As patrons that evening found their seats and read of the addition to the evening's performance, they were alerted to a retraction from the concert lineup as well. From the same motive, the closing portion of the Ninth Symphony, noted the insert, quote, the hymn to joy will be omitted. Although there were those that wanted to escape the current realities the country faced by attending the spring concert performance, there was no joy to be found in the deaths of approximately 750,000 Americans in the assassination of a president. In a peculiar turn of events, which were criticized in the New York press, the Philharmonic omitted that last movement, an ode to joy. What was there to be joyful about? The President of the United States had been assassinated. 750,000 Americans had given their last full measure of devotion. But the New York press thought that by getting rid of or omitting the ode to joy was inappropriate. A letter to the editor would appear just 2 weeks after the performance on May 13, 1865, edition of Dwight's Journal of Music. And in it, it said this, quote, one of the first entertainments presented to us after the sad, although brief, season of public mourning was the closing concert of the Philharmonic Society. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was promised. It was looked forward to during the whole winter by subscribers. But instead of giving us this great monument of human genius and its completeness, the society performed the three first parts alone, thus cutting off Beethoven's sublime idea at the very point where it reaches its culmination. It was difficult for the audience assembled to accept the excuse given on the program that the vocal part of the symphony was omitted out of respect to the memory of our lamented president, as a very general knowledge had got abroad that there had been difficulties in regard to obtaining an efficient chorus and solo singers. But we would be more willing to take the latter excuse as the reason for the omission than the former. For looking beyond and above the unlooked-for tragedy of his mortal end, what could be more in keeping with the genial, humane, benevolent, and liberal character of the good man, the great work of whose life was the liberation of all races, than the words of Schiller's deep and beautiful Ode to Joy, a joy not superficial, but of the soul, glorified with such strains as only Beethoven could, and his highest inspiration and imagine. The orchestra played at this concert as an opening piece, and very appropriately, the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, and Schumann's beautiful overture, scherzo, and finale, opus 52 at the close. Besides this, a chorus for men's voices by Schubert and Mendelssohn's Lorelei finale. How far this finale, if we accept the greater facilities it presents to the chorus, was more appropriate to the spirit of the times than that of Beethoven's symphony, we leave to be decided by more profound intellects than our own. For the praiseworthy Philharmonic Committee wrapped itself in cloudy darkness on the subject. Today, we're going to end our program in a unique way. We're going to end the program by looking chronologically at the numerous photographs and sketches of the Lincoln funeral train arriving in the many cities as it traveled westward to Springfield, Illinois, for Lincoln to be placed in a final and fitting place of rest. Now, we're not going to listen to the entire 18 minutes today of that funeral march written by Ludwig van Beethoven, but we are going to listen to just several moments of it as we follow these images chronologically to Lincoln's final resting place. So I'm going to ask for you to bear with me for just a moment as I organize the technology to be able to do this. We had some trial and error with the technology earlier this week and today, and the couple different ways we tried it did not work. So I'm going to be closing out of this screen for just a moment. I would ask of you to perhaps turn your volume up a little bit. The beginning of the symphony will start quietly. And so with that, we will follow Lincoln's train ride to his last resting place. So as you can see, in the weeks, months, and years after the assassination of Lincoln, the country really reacted in a multitude of ways, particularly when it came to expressing what in fact is a final and fitting proper tribute to their martyred president. We saw those like Walt Whitman that turned to a form of poetry, American free verse, to express his grief and his shock and his mourning to the loss of Abraham Lincoln. We saw the reaction of those in Washington, D.C. that would band together over the course of 3 years of after the assassination of Lincoln to raise funds to put a monument and memorial to Lincoln in front of the City Hall of the District of Columbia. We saw how out of the unifying grief and sorrow of the Lincoln assassination, such as places in Jersey City, New Jersey, coming together, and not only coming together to discuss the events and to reflect on the loss of Lincoln in April of 1865, but to make it an annual gathering to really expand upon the life of Lincoln, a gathering that has yet to cease all of these years later. We saw those that opted to pay tribute to Lincoln in a fitting and proper way on the House floor in Washington, D.C., through speeches like that of James Garfield and speeches given throughout the country in the days, weeks, months, and years after the death of Lincoln. And we also saw how music played a vital role in paying tribute to Lincoln. Certainly over the 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century, numerous pieces of music have been written and composed and dedicated in honor of Lincoln. Perhaps one of the most famous, a Lincoln Portrait by Aaron Copland. But it was Theodore Eisfeld and the New York Philharmonic Orchestra that would pay one of the earliest musical tributes to Lincoln by performing Beethoven's Funeral March from the Third Symphony on April 29th, 1865. Well, I hope that you enjoyed the program today as we looked at the various types of reactions to the Lincoln assassination and the forms of fitting and proper tribute that was paid to the 16th President of the United States. If you are dialed into the Zoom meeting, please click chat at the bottom of your screen and state that you have a question in the chat. We will unmute each of you for long enough to ask your question out loud. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please type your question into that chat, and Diane will be reading each of those questions aloud after we have finished the Zoom questions. So we'll give you an opportunity to open it up here for Q&A.
Dan, can we get you back? Can we get your face back?
Yes, indeed. There we go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. And having heard this the second time, it struck me with your undergraduate degree in music, you certainly would appreciate how difficult that would be for an orchestra to be thrown a new piece 2 weeks before performance.
Absolutely.
I'll start off the questions.
Sure.
Why did Walt Whitman wait 22 years to write "Oh Captain, My Captain"? I mean, that just seems like a long time.
Yeah, it's really interesting in Whitman's career where he was in 1865. I honestly, I'm by no means a Whitman scholar, but I think it took Whitman a profound amount of time to deal with the experiences of the war for him. He had really seen the ravages of the war up close and personal. He had seen, the mangled bodies making it back to these long-term large hospitals in Washington, D.C. and other metropolitan areas. He nursed the sick that had, really just wasted away in these armies on campaign. And these armies in camp. So by the time that Whitman's views on Lincoln evolve over the course of the war, and then there's just this abrupt end to everything with Lincoln's assassination, I really think it took Whitman a while to just process and put into writing how profound that moment was for him, how profound that moment was for our country, and how profound it was for, as Whitman termed it, the common American, to be able to encapsulate all of that into his poem, Captain, My Captain.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions from Zoom? No. Allison Barish from Facebook just said to say thank you. She said it was very interesting.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Maggie, any questions? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate it. Appreciate you doing this for us. I know it was challenging when it came to technology, but I think the message came across.
I have a really quick little question, and I think you answered in the course of your speech. I've always wondered how you speak about it. April 14th, April 15th. He was assassinated on the 14th. We commemorate his death on the 15th. Those are actually two different things. We always talk about his assassination, but that happened the day before his death.
Right.
Assassination is the act of being shot, and then of course the day we commemorate his death is the 15th. But you actually address that in your remarks.
Yeah.
He wasn't assassinated. Assassination isn't the act of dying; it's the act of being shot.
Correct. And I think there's an important distinction in there when these forms of memorial tributes come out as to what moment that they refer to. Are they referring to the act of the assassination on the 14th, or are they referring to the death of Lincoln on the morning of the 15th? And I would say that at least in the ones that we looked at today, and a number of the other ones that I know of, many of them focus on the act of on April 14th as the date to commemorate. You see the New York Philharmonic is looking at the 14th, 2 weeks from the day when they perform. We look at the date that James Garfield in his speech says that we should come together every April 14th and remember this moment in American history.
Now we think more of the 15th as, that was the day he died, 155
Yes.
years later. So that's, I guess when I'm talking about it, I kind of use both dates. So,
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Maggie,
You're welcome.
that reminded me, Dan, I don't know if you knew this. When we were renovating the SB post, our general contractor, his name's Rabbit, came running downstairs. He was so excited because they had pulled out one of the cabinets up in the SB post, and they found a little pin with a clock face on it with the exact time that Lincoln died. Because it had fallen behind this cabinet.
Wow.
So we have that on display there.
That's and I would encourage anyone, if you've not been to the EPSB post, that once everything starts opening back up, when you guys open back up, to absolutely visit and tie in today's conversation by looking for that piece of history in the display.
And I'll say one more thing, because I have no idea what's going on, but our plans at this point in time are that this February the 2021, we will again be performing Aaron Copland's Lincoln portrait, which is such a
wonderful
contemporary, that was commissioned during World War II. And I've read that part of it was to remind people that we have been through and recovered from difficult times before. And that'll probably be a fitting concert if we're gathering in large numbers doing, this February. But
Right.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, Dan, best to you and Sarah over in Ohio.
Yes, and best to all of those watching today. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay well.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.